Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Neil Halp, and I'm a professor of pediatrics, public health, and public policy at UCLA at the Center for Healthier Children, Families, and Communities. This webinar is being hosted by the Life Course Intervention Research Network, a national network of over 100 active researchers and 2,000 members, all of whom are working to improve health across the lifespan. I know that we have many of our network members online today, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I also want to thank our funders, the Maternal and Child Health Bureau, who support the LCIRN in making this webinar possible. Today, we're honored to have two of the most accomplished life course researchers of our time joining us. Glen Elder is the Odom Distinguished Research Professor of Sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Elder is truly a legendary figure in the development of life course theory, methods, and research. He has championed the life course research approach throughout his career, considering people in relationship to their historical time and place. He's authored over 500 articles, books, and book chapters, and his work has been enormously influential throughout the social and health sciences. Rick Settersten is University Distinguished Professor of Human Development and Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs at the Oregon State University. He served as head of the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences in OSU's College of Public Health and Human Sciences, as the founding director of the Hallie F. Ford Center for Healthy Children and Families. He's an expert in life course studies with a focus on adolescent and adulthood. And I have to say, I had the pleasure of visiting with Rick several years ago and spending time with him and his colleagues at OSU, and it was really a wonderful, marvelous experience for me. Glen and Rick are here today to talk about their new book entitled Living on the Edge, an American Generation's Journey Through the 20th Century. After the talk, we will hear from two discussants about their impressions of the book, and we hope to have some time for questions and answers. Our two discussants will be two of our life course intervention research scholars. One is Carol Leon. Carol is an assistant professor at NYU and the Grossman School of Medicine. The other is Emily Hotez, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at UCLA. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to Rick and Glen, and we'll take it away.
Thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure for us to be here with you.
Thanks from me as well. Thank you for your kind words, and to Shirley and to Mary for their help with all the logistics. Of course, to Carol and to Emily, who will be who've read the book and are prepared to give some comments and critique, and I think Chris will also be moderating the discussion. So we look forward to that discussion. With that, I'll just pass it over to Glen. Why don't you go ahead and get it started? Glen is going to say a little something about how the book came about.
Right. So our story began in 1972-73 as I completed Children of the Great Depression at the Berkeley Institute of Human Development. This project followed a birth cohort of 1920-21 in Oakland, California through the Great Depression up to middle age. The study left me and others wondering about the Depression's effect on younger children, an issue of developmental age and timing. With this in mind, I turned to the Berkeley cohort, born in 1928-29, to find out. This comparative analysis provided compelling evidence of a developmental timing effect by cohort and gender. Namely, the younger boys were adversely influenced by hard times and the punitive behavior of their fathers in particular. This was not the case for the Oakland boys and for girls in general. Children of the Great Depression also made the case for doing a longer span study into the later years of life. That was actually possible with the Berkeley 1900 generation of parents. This study had uniquely collected data on the lives of the Berkeley parents, mother and father, as well as the studied child. My 1972-73 sabbatical focused on the parents since I recognized the potential for a major book on their lives. I began an outline of the book chapters with detailed outlines and drafts as the chapters into the next century. By 2010, I realized I needed assistance and asked Rick and Lisa Pearce for help in turning the drafts into chapters of a book. In a workshop, we discussed our reviews of all the chapter drafts that to this day represents probably the memorable high point of our collaboration. After nearly 50 years on this project, I still wonder how I could have taken it on at the time. My answer today is that I couldn't resist the challenge after working on Children of the Great Depression and running into this wonderful archive. Doing children told me how to work with archival data. Old data must be reworked in a recoding process, a story we told in working with archival data in 1993. The Berkeley Data Archive gave me a rare chance to investigate the process of human development and aging across most of the lifespan. Now, a few observations from our book by Rick.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. I would simply like to introduce very briefly, a couple of the very many themes in the book. And many of those themes challenge conventional wisdom because we're able to observe firsthand what was actually going on in the first half of the last century. A first big theme really relates to, this first big theme relates to how rapidly changing world affects human lives, how social change leaves people feeling unsettled and disoriented, how it demands that they adapt to and cope with change, how it alters their lives in ways that are often profound and unforeseen. And this seems especially relevant in our own era of accelerated change and discord. A second theme is about how much these men and women were pioneers in navigating work and family life. So for women, on the heels of having secured the right to vote, these women, mainly many college educated, really saw their potential influence, their potential for progress as being inside the domestic sphere. They expressed their agency by redefining marriage as more companionate. Many of the men struggled with their mandate to be breadwinners, both the difficulty of achieving that mandate in the Great Depression, but also the grueling pace of it during World War II. Surprisingly, however, many of these women worked. And when we look at women's work across three different eras, during family formation, during the Great Depression, and during World War II, we find that about a third of the women were actually in the labor force in all three of those eras. Only 7% of these women never worked in those three eras. So a big theme of the book is really going to be about a story about women rising, to use Claude Fisher's term, he recently wrote a blog about the book and made the point that nothing has affected the personal lives of Americans over the last century as deeply as the ascendance of women. He sees it as our story as one about how great events upset patriarchal family relationships and arrangements and lay the groundwork for women's empowerment in this century. A third big theme really relates to how these parents, surprisingly again, set the stage for the intensive parenting that we know today. Especially in the middle class, they begin to redefine parenthood as more child-focused and science-driven. And couples are becoming a lot more conscious of the role of fathers in the development of children. And these men also want to become better husbands and fathers. We also see major challenges with respect to the interdependence of family relationships. Of course, members of this 1900 generation were already managing family life before any of the government programs that we take for granted today were established. And at a time when receiving public aid was highly stigmatizing. So facing hard times meant relying on family members for support and finding support in whatever ways you could. And giving and receiving help in the context of these extended families really begins to show how much reservation, resentment, and even hostility can build up as family members are trying to help one another through hard times. And this is especially true when families have to double up in order to make ends meet. And we're often so affected or struck by how profoundly affected this generation is in having to make really difficult choices in the face of hardship, not having additional children, giving up their homes, needing to leave their possessions behind, making extraordinary reductions in their standards of living, losing their social status, and doing everything they can to save face in light of the hardship they're experiencing. And finally, given that so many of the people here present in this webinar today are interested in matters of health and well-being and public health, Glen will say a little something now about the legacy of the past in later life. Glen?
Thank you, Rick. We followed the 1900 generation from one period of history to another. And I think one of the things that are really important to keep in mind is the transition from good times to hard times to good times to hard times. A challenge, that kind of disruptive transition is characteristic of the life course here. So when we followed them from 1900 across the prosperous 20s into the hardships of the Great Depression, and then back into the prospering war years, and then the post-war period. All of those are discontinuous and disruptive kinds of challenges. At all points across these years of the 20th century, we find the Berkeley men were less healthy emotionally than the women. Men lost and women gained emotional health across these years. A major reason, we argue, is the role options for husbands tended to lock them in to what we call a breadwinner mandate, with the expectation that they would and must support their family. They were caught in a no-win situation. Their inability to support their family often led to intense feelings of shame and despair, to scenes like a husband with head in hands grieving at the kitchen table beside his wife, who is hysterical with fear that her husband would actually take his life. Married women were homemakers in a large sense in this culture, not paid employees, though many Berkeley wives held half-time jobs while their children were in school. And both roles across their entire life became a major source of self-confidence and resilience. Some 30 years later, after hardship, among 40 surviving couples, wives emerged as more agentic and resilient than their husbands. A review of, I think one of the themes I was going to cover was Claude Fisher's interesting observation, because it really does connect with the picture of women rising and the decline of the well-being of men across time. And if we look at colleges today, we see it, all the evidence of it, with increasing percentages of women in college and decreasing percentages of men. So I will close by just turning it over, I think, to Rick.
Actually, Glenn, would you like to say something about the dualities of experience,
okay, right.
especially in the depression?
That's right. Okay. Yeah. As we follow these people into their later years, as they look back on their life, and what they see is, in many ways, something that Charles Dickens wrote about many years ago. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And if you look across the decades of their lives, you find similarities to those observations. For example, in the 20s, in terms of the happiness of, this is in the beginning of their married life, really, and the happiness of their marriage versus the challenge of making a living and the challenges there. The 30s certainly had the conflict between having children and postponing them, and the agony that many families had to go through in this regard. But the joys also in bringing up their children during this period. The 40s, in terms of the good news from the front, the war front, as well as the bad news. The availability of wonderful jobs and earnings that were unheard of before, in contrast to the stress of long working days and weeks. Couple of men in the sample talked about, we had no jobs and then we had too much work, and the contrast there was really quite striking, and I think it was very costly in terms of the lives of these men who were in their later years at this time. So I will turn it over to Rick and he will close it.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks, Glenn. I love that theme of the duality of experience, which, as you said, gets revealed especially in the contrast between the not just the contrast in the experience of a single event like the Depression, but also the contrast as historical events get strung together, and the experience of one is understood in the context of what came before.
Right.
So let me just close now with a couple of comments on as we work toward a discussion around the 1900 generation as a hinge generation. So this generation is going to encounter what Robert Gordon called a century of revolutionary change. As we've already alluded to, their lives were marked by migration, by wartime, by dramatic swings in the economy, both depression and prosperity. by unimaginable inventions and advances in science and technology. As one of the quotes we love in the book is from somebody associated with the study in the 1980s who said, "Never again will history equal the rate of change of this period, from covered wagons to the moon." And it just so nicely encapsulates the magnificent scope of change that members of this generation saw in their lifetime. And as Glenn was just saying, it becomes so apparent that that our task is not just to understand the imprint of a particular historical moment or condition or event, but to also understand the great swings of history and how those things interact and leave a unique imprint on generations and on the people in them. Here, Glenn just mentioned the zigzagging from the World War One years to the Great Depression, and then again to World War II. And it's about understanding those things in combination that we're also sort of uniquely positioned to see, given that we're tracing the impact of these things across their whole lives. And so I guess the 1900 generation brings some important lessons for understanding, as I said before, our own era of accelerating change and discord and the unrest of our own times as we're conducting research now, for example, related to the pandemic in ways that are positioned to try to understand its short and long-term impacts and its differential impacts on different groups in the population. But we argue in the book that this 1900 generation is what Leonard Kane called a hinge generation, or a bridge between the past and the present. Their lives are going to were dramatically different from the generations before them. And what we so often find is that they're wrestling with and instigating a set of changes that will end up echoing throughout the rest of the century and for later generations. And what I have on the slide here is just some examples of the ways in which this generation becomes a hinge generation as it straddles the century. And I guess kind of at the end of this long enterprise of ours, and in studying this generation born more than 100 years ago, we're reminded of the fact that many of the things that we assume are somehow unique to our own times are actually shared with and built upon the actions and ideas of people long before us.